Hello, welcome to the UI Collection View series, and today is the third video of this tutorial, and we're going to talk about how to do a simple networking. We're going to fetch JSON data from a remote server and then transform that data into a product object which will eventually display in our UI Collection View. In the previous videos, we have learned how to create a grid using the UI Collection View. And then in the second video, I have shown you how you could customize the UICollectionViewCells, where we added the image view and then a couple of UI labels. We also have created the product struct, which we'll be using in wrapping the data for our UICollectionViewCells. So our product object has the title, the price, and the URL to our image. And then we have used the Kingfisher library, which helped us in asynchronously downloading the image data and also setting that image in our UI image view. And now I'm going to start creating our store API, which we'll be using and doing the networking for us and then transforming the JSON data into our product object. So I'm going to right click here in the navigator and then click new file, and make sure that Swift file is selected and then click next, and then we will call the file store API. So the file name has nothing to do with the name of your class, so you could name your files any way you want, and then it will not affect the your class names. So here I'm going to call this class store API. It's just a best practice, to use the same name as your class. Your file name the same as your class names, so that it's more convenient to locate the file. And we will have one method in our store API class. I'm going to call it products. So the products will, of course, return the list of products for us. But we are not going to use the traditional way of returning an array. We are going to use Swift Combine so that we could use Combine's features in doing asynchronous work for us and also transforming the data into our product object. So before I go ahead, I'm going to import the Combine framework. So if you're interested in learning Combine, I have other videos in the channel that teaches you about the basics and some other tricks in Swift Combine. So we are going to use the future publisher. So the future is normally used when you are going to do some asynchronous task. It means that it returns when the task is completed, or it will return an error if it encountered some error within the task. And it requires you to set the output and the error type. Our output type is going to be an array of product. And then you need to set what is the type of your error. It could be error, NS error, or any type of error, but in this case I'm not going to return any error, which is eventually will be just an empty array of product. And we need to create the future object or publisher by first I'm going to type the return, and then to create the future object, type the future, open and close curly braces, and then there would be a parameter value. It's going to be called promise. So this promise object, you're going to use that in either finishing the asynchronous task by calling the success or calling the promise method and then set the success value, or passing in a failure. Okay, so within this block, we're going to create our networking task. So we will be using the URL session. So it's an object, that will do the networking for us. And then we will need to create an instance or use a shared instance, and we will be using the extension of URL session, which is going to be the data task publisher. So it's an extension which is sort of a publisher. So if we call the data task publisher, it then creates a combined publisher for us. By the way, the URL session, you could use this, and if you have some data tasks such as getting JSON data or XML or some data from remote server, you use the data task. If you want to download a file, an image, then you would use the download task, and you can also upload if you want. So the URL session has these methods that could help you with these networking tasks. Alright, so our data task publisher, it will be returning a publisher, which I'm going to set in a constant. But now we need to address or set the URL. So we'll be creating a URL object, and then as always, URL objects can return nil because sometimes the URL we're passing is not valid. That's why it's an optional object. But then since for demonstration, we're sure that the URL is working, I am going to unwrap it or force unwrap it. And let me just copy the URL. And I'm going to paste the URL here, which is a string, and unwrap the instance. And like I said earlier, it's going to return another instance or object, which is a publisher. I'm going to create a constant and call it a task publisher. So now we have another publisher. In Swift Combine, there are a lot of operators that you could use, and also you can create a subscription so that you could subscribe to the downstream data that is coming from our URL session publisher. So the first thing I would want to do is transform that or get that data from the response, right? So when you're talking to a remote server and then you get a response, in that response you could also have the data. So I am going to use the map operator. So using the task publisher, I'm going to use the map. Alright, so the map operator will help you in transforming an incoming data and then returning the transformed data, so that the downstream subscribers will be able to receive that newly transformed data. And normally there would be a parameter here, a parameter value, but then we're going to use the $0. The $0 it's a shorthand which refers to the first parameter. 0 for the first parameter. If there are two parameters, then you would use $1. Third parameter would be $2, right? So it's like the index in an array. So we already have the parameter object or the response, and then it has a data property which we can return. Now in this form, it means that we are already returning the data. Optionally, you could use the return keyword if you want, but then it's not required. It's it's inferred that we are returning something. Okay, so now that I have the data, what I want to do is transform that data into a JSON or into the product object, right? So I am going to use the decode operator, and since we have created our product object, we can use that so that that object will be created. So in the decode method or operator, we just tell the operator, okay, we are going to use the product as the template, for instance, and then we also need to create a decoder, a JSON decoder. But before I move forward with this, I'm gonna go back to the product struct. I need to make it conform to the decodable protocol. So the decodable protocol will help in the transformation of that JSON data into the product. Okay, and then I'm gonna head over back to the store API, and here, so what I'm gonna do is, since we're expecting an array, because the data that we are receiving, the JSON data we're receiving is an array of a product object. So I'm going to create an array and then product and then self. Here we are declaring that we expect that the decoding task will produce an array of product. So basically this is what it means. And then we also need to create an instance of a decoder. Since it's JSON, so we have JSON decoder. So now we have an instance of a JSON decoder. It will help us in transforming the data into an array of product. Now what we need to do is to get that data, and we're going to use the sync subscription. And sync will, with sync we will be able to get the completion status and also the product value. All right. First is we're going to get a completion. So completion is an enum where you could check if a failure had happened or if the transaction was a success. So completion, I'm going to, since it's an enum, then I'm going to use a switch statement and completion. And there are two possible cases. One is finished, but I'm just going to print finished. In other cases, you would be doing something here. Perhaps when it finished, you would update the user interface, and it's possible that it will fail. And normally failure will return an error like this, and then an error, and then you can use that and pass it around. But in my case, I would not be using it. So failure, and then eventually I'd call the promise object to say, okay, even though it's a failure, I would treat it as a success. So promise, and then success. Then I would be passing, I'm required to pass in the product array, because I said in the future here it should expect a product array. Now since it's a failure, I don't have any product, right? So I'm just going to create an empty product array, right? So after this, I also need to receive the products. So I will be receiving a value here. So it's going to be the array of products. And of course, I am going to call promise. And then now I have the array of products. I would be able to pass that product array, products. So like I said earlier, the future, it has a promise, and future, it's possible that it's going to encounter an array, a failure. Then we call the failure promise that failure. It's possible that the output is also going to be a success. Then we call the success. So if you're passing any data, like here, you declare the type of the data. So it will also expect you to pass that data in your success. Okay, and lastly, whenever you use or whenever you subscribe to a combined publisher, it will return an any cancelable object. This gives you a chance to cancel cancel the subscription or the publisher whenever you call cancel on this any cancelable. But in this case, I'm just going to store it somewhere. If I'm not going to reference that any cancelable, then the subscription will not work. The sync subscription will produce an any cancelable, and it will also trigger the data task publisher. Alright, so I'm just going to create a cancelable variable here, and it's going to be a set of any cancelable. Alright, so there are two ways to store a reference, store the reference of any cancelable. Either you create a set, or you just create a variable, or a variable with an any cancelable. Because if I'm not going to use a set, I can just get the return instance and then set it to that property, any cancelable property. But in this case, I'm going to store it, use the store method, and set it in the cancelable property. So this should already work for us. And then it's telling me there's an error. Oh, okay. Yeah, so we need to use the self. I'm just going to auto fix it, and it's not doing it. Alright, and I'm just going to type self here. Self. Oh, okay. It did it here. Alright, so there you go. It fixed it, and I think this is now going to work if we're going to use that in our view controller. Alright, so what did we do? We have used Swift Combine in our asynchronous task. We also used the URL session data task publisher so that we could fetch the products array, JSON array from the remote server. We transform the response by returning the data property using a map operator, and then we use the decode method or decode operator in transforming it into a product array from JSON data. And then we use the sync subscription so that we could trigger the subscription and receive the completion status and also the value from the map operator and the decoder. And now we're gonna move to the view controller so that we could use the product information and then set it in our collection view. Now let's start using the store API. So I'm going to create a variable, so private var, and then API, and we're going to create an instance of the store API. So it's a good practice to set properties and methods private so that it's not exposed to to other objects if you intend it to be private. Otherwise you make it public. So we're going to use the API instance in our get products, and then we're going to call the products method that we have created earlier, which is a publisher. So with publishers you can subscribe to it. Before subscribing, I'm just going to make sure that whatever we're receiving it on the main queue or the main thread. So I'm going to use the receive on, since we are going to display the product information on the UI, which is also on the main thread. I'm going to call use dispatch queue, and then main, which refers to the main thread, and then I can now subscribe to the publisher. So once the subscription is created, it means it will now be receiving data from the publisher. I'm going to call this products, and once we receive the products, I'm going to set it to the products array that I have created in the previous video. So products, and of course if you have new data, then you can now display it on the screen. What you need to do is use the reference to the collection view and then call the reload data. So reload data is like refresh, right? So if you want to refresh your collection view, or if you have a table view, you will call reload data. And every time you create a subscription, it creates an any cancelable object, and I'm going to store it somewhere on a variable. So I'm going to call store in a cancelable. Right, so we can reuse or copy the cancelable variable, and then I'm going to set it there. So now the cancelable is going, or the any cancelable instance is going to be stored in the cancelable property. We need to fix this by importing the combine framework. Okay, so before I run this application, I need to make some adjustments in our product struct. The price in the JSON document is a float, and then it doesn't have an image URL field. Instead, it has image. But then if you're dealing with JSON documents or fields that has different names that are names that you don't want to use in your struct or in your classes, you can actually choose to override decodable and then make the adjustments there. So decoding and encoding is pretty, I would say, flexible in terms of the names that you're going to set or use. If you have a preferred name to use in your classes or struct, then you have that option, even though the JSON object has a different name or JSON field has a different name. If it's image underscore URL in the JSON document, but then you're going to use image URL, or in camel case, it's possible, but it will just require some extra steps in the decoding or in creating your decodable struct. Okay, let me just change price to float, and then I remove the URL because it's just image. Let me show you the JSON response. So it's float here and then image. Okay, going back to our project, since we have changed the type and the name, we also need to make some adjustments in our collection view cell where we set these values. Now price is not a string. I'm going to make a string by using a string interpolation and then prepend it with a $sign. So now it's going to say dollar and then the value. And our n, we also need to rename this to image. Alright, so I think that's it, and I think we need to test what we have done. It's a good practice that whenever you make changes or add features, you always do some tests. Okay, so I think I need to, alright, so I forgot to remove this. Let me just remove this example data, and it just reminded me that I have to call get products. So when view did load is called, I have to call get products. Alright, and hopefully the product information now will be displayed in the collection view. And then I'm expecting that there would be some kind of error as well on the UI, but then I'm going to deal with it in a bit. Alright, so we already have our product information displayed on the collection view, and as you can see in the debugger, we have some auto layout issues or collection view flow layout issues happening. We can easily fix that in the storyboard. Remember that if you watch the first video, we set our own custom size programmatically, which is in the UI collection view delegate flow layout, and then return a specific size. And then we have to turn off something in the storyboard. We can also do that programmatically, but we're going to do that in the storyboard. So here I'm going to select the the collection view, and then in the estimated size I'm going to turn it off. and let me just run this again, and then this should display the UI collection views correctly based on the size that we have set programmatically. Okay, so now the product information are displaying correctly. So when I scroll, the size of the UI collection view cells doesn't change. It remains to whatever size that we set. All right, so there's one thing I need to add. It's I want to add a loading indicator or like a progress indicator on the screen while we are fetching the data from the remote server. And I have noticed that my internet connection is a bit slow, so I was noticing that it's quite um, the page is blank, and then I, as a user, I don't know what's happening, if it's loading or if it's encountering any error. And what I can do is display something on the screen while we're loading the data. I'm going to go to the library, and then I'm going to use a label to indicate the status of uh, the asynchronous loading of the data. And then in the label, I'm going to say probably loading. So just for demonstration, I'm going to set the text loading, and then I'm going to change the font size to something large and visible on the screen. Let me change the font color to dark gray. Okay, and I want to position this at the center, so I'm going to give it a height of 43, and I'm not going to set the width. And let me just zoom in so that you could see it. And then for the center axis, it's going to be horizontally centered and vertically centered. All right, so there you go. And I'm going to check if it's okay. Let me just move that there. Okay. Oh, it didn't move. Let me move that. Or okay, it doesn't want to move. All right, so there you go. So we can see that it's going to display loading. Okay, so what we will do is when we're loading the data, we're going to hide the view controller. And then when we have successfully loaded the data, then we'll display the UI view controller. So here, before we load, before we go and get products, I'm going to hide the collection view is hidden, and then we're going to set it to true. And then here in the once we have received the products, we're going to show our collection view. So collection view that is hidden to false. All right, and then I also need to set the self instance here as weak, because it's possible that it's going to be nil by the time that we have we have received the response. So I just want to show you some best practices in terms of when working with asynchronous task, and then if you have some code that's running within some blocks, and you're also referencing self or another object. So you have options like unown, or if you want to reference, if you're not gonna set unown or weak to your object, then you might have a strong reference and then cause some memory leak, or even a crash if the object is nil or self is nil. Okay, so I think we're good with this, and then we can test this now. So by the time the view did loads, the collection view is hidden, and then after we receive the product information, then the collection view is gonna be displayed. There you go. So I think we need to adjust our loading label and set it to behind the collection view. And yeah, now it's in front. I'm just going to send it back like before and try again. So it's a simple technique in displaying a static loader. So hiding and then displaying the new state. So you have a couple of states. All right, so there you go. We have successfully fetched the remote data and displayed it on our UI collection view cells. So finally, we have completed all the videos and also completed in creating our UI collection view and then fetching data from remote data, customizing the UI collection view cells, and I hope that you have enjoyed and learned something from this tutorial.